Hello, now we're into the very first week of Introduction to Sociology, or Gen Ed, and it's all online. And we're going to look at Chapter 1 first. And if you check your syllabus, you'll see which chapters we do. And I'll be doing your chapters in 2 weeks. So one half and one half, something to that effect. And the first chapter here we're looking at is essentially what is sociology. We're looking at sociological imagination, which is really important. And we're going to look at the global perspective of a sociological imagination as well, and life chances. In the next week, we're going to look at theories and the theoretical perspectives, and look at a general perspective of different theories. All right, so I hope you do really well on this. Don't forget to try to pause the video from time to time so that you can be able to do this very well. Make notes, underline, sticky notes, the whole bit to help you prepare for the test that comes up. All right, so let's get started right away. Okay, we're going to start putting social life into perspective. We're going to look first a bit about what is sociology by definition, and then we're going to move into an important element about sociology, and that is sociological imagination. So it's basically looking outside of yourself. We'll also look at and touch on global sociological perspective. Now, it's taking this sociological imagination and putting it to a global perspective, and that is to understand how we are separately or together with the global world. How are we similar, and what are the commonalities and patterns that are similar, and also look at some of those differences. Now, that topic will predominantly go into sociology too. And then lastly, I'm going to touch on what are called life chances. And this becomes pretty important in regards to changing your perspective and your point of view and your circumstances, in this case, Canadian society. Okay, so what is sociology? Well, by definition, sociology is a systematic study of human societies and social interactions. Sociologists study human societies and their social interactions in order to develop theories, and we're going to get into second week looking at theories of how behavior is shaped by a group or by group life, and how, on the other hand, group life is affected by individuals. And so sociology, as it differs from psychology, is sociology looks at the role of groups that we are either a part of and participate in. Maybe you were part of a baseball team or a hockey team. Maybe you've been involved in Girl Guides or Boy Scouts or church groups or in education. So how do these things influence you? But also in the long run, how can you as an individual influence the group? And that's one of the main perspectives about sociology, whereas psychology looks at how do you become you? What are the conditions, the circumstances, the pieces of how you get to become you. Now, sociology touches on that a bit too, but that's the main objective, is the development of theories about how behavior is shaped by group life and how group life can affect individuals. Now, an important person in the beginning of sociology was this guy here. There we go. Charles Wright Mills. And he came up with what was considered to be an important element about sociology, what was called sociological imagination. And it's defined as the ability to see the relationship between one's individual experiences and that of the larger society. And so it's really a separation between those things that are personal or private issues and those things that are public issues, and how they relate to one another and how each can contribute to our life circumstances. So for example, if you're looking at personal or private troubles, you could consider that the individual and the network of people who I'm associating with on a regular basis influence my circumstances. So for example, if we look at homelessness, this could be based on an individual or private trouble, something that's gone on in their life. They've lost a job. They've developed a mental health issues which has affected some of the conditions in their life. Unemployment, divorce, family violence, all of these can be viewed as personal issues that people, due to circumstances within their own lives, participate in and experience in their lives, which affect their circumstances. Now, The other side of this very same coin, this is where sociological imagination is important, is public issues. Matters beyond the individual, beyond their own personal control, that are caused by problems originating at a societal level. And again, you can look at homelessness, unemployment, divorce, family violence, and say that there are also public circumstances. A change in government. We're going to have an election in October, and if there's a change in government, there's a change in some policies, and some of those policies will affect individuals, whether that's in education, housing, employment, and that could affect people's homes, unemployment, divorce, how they handle stress, and the stress that's been experienced by them. So it's important when we look at sociological imagination that we don't just point a finger at the individual and say they're bad, that if they just did better, their life would be better. Because there are times, and many times, when in our lives there are bigger issues that impact us that aren't not because we're deficient or inadequate, but sometimes things affect us. And so this is what is important about sociological imagination, is just not to take a personal view on everything and blame the victim, but sometimes consider that there are external things that can affect individuals beyond their control. Now, in Wright's sort of view here, there was a promise that the first fruit of the imagination enables the person to interpret his or her experience and gauge one's own fate by locating oneself on the historical period when one lives. That is to say, what's important about that is that where we are today, we're able to, through our imagination, be able to get some perspective of where things were, say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and start to imagine how we are today. That there are some things privately that we're able to do differently that will affect our positive outcome. And there's things that could occur within the public. So for example, look at the election. Now I could sit back and not vote, thinking there's no role that I play and that any change in government or anything that I could do will have no change on my circumstance, and then don't vote. But then the other part of the public view is, as an individual, I can vote, and collectively, our votes can either keep a government or change a government, which can have an impact on each of our lives. Okay? So why do we study sociology? Well, let's look at that. Now, when we're thinking about why study sociology, well, part of it is to get a better view on a scientific-based, data-based, unbiased perspective about the world around us. So the goal for sociology is largely about being as value-free as possible. So not to bring in your point of view, your personal perspective, your beliefs, but to keep them at the door and do research based on the real data that comes in, look at that data and help see what that data tells you about the world around you. Sociologists attempt to discover patterns or commonalities in human behavior. You know, as Canadians, we have certain behaviors that make us Canadians. As people living in Owen Sound, there are certain behaviors. You can go across Canada and hear different slangs, if you will, language styles across Canada. And so those are patterns. And sociologists look and see, what are the patterns that exist? How do they come about? What are the influences of these patterns? And how many of these patterns do we find in other cultures around the world that are similar to the ones that we find in Canada? Not that they do the same things, but they evolve in the same manner, or they've got similar aspects that contribute to how societies form and evolve. So they search for multiple causes. It's also known as correlational. So rather there being a single cause for, say, homelessness, there are correlational causes or correlational explanations. There's more than one reason that homelessness exists. It's not just the lack of money or the lack of a job or not having a home. It could be other variables that can contribute to a person becoming homeless. So they are correlational. They exist at the same time, but they're not cause and effect. And a lot of sociology is a lot like that, looking for the kinds of explanations that can
give us insight as to why phenomena exist.
So when we consider the central concepts about sociology, we would consider society as a central concept. And this is a large social gathering that shares the same geographical territory and is subject to the same political authority and dominant cultural expectations. So Canada would be considered a society. We share a geographic territory, the borders separating, U.S. and Canada, and then of course the oceans. Um, we have a similar political authority in terms of right now we have Harper and the Conservatives as the Prime Minister and federal authority, and dominant culture. There is what we would call a Canadian culture. Americans know who Canadians are by the way they talk, the way we behave, even in some cases the way we dress. And we would say the same about the US and other cultures. Now, global interdependence in terms of a concept in society is issues in one part of the world affect issues in another part of the world. So, for example, where this global interdependence, there are parts of the world that aren't very developed yet. They're not using a lot of technology. They don't have a lot of access to the kinds of resources that we in North America have. And yet the environmental conditions that we produce affect other parts of the world. Wars and conflict that exist in one part of the world can affect other parts of the world. Famine, AIDS, the economy shifts and changes. These all can have ripple effects throughout the world. So this is what they mean by global interdependence. Interdependence really just means that one thing affects another. A relationship in which the lives of all people are intertwined closely, and any one nation's problem are a part of a larger global pattern. Okay, so when we look at why study sociology, I'd like you to look at on page 5 the common sense knowledge and do the little quiz. Um, Common sense is most often based on belief, not so much on fact. And sociology, going in as a science and doing research based on unbiased data, produces more social facts that give us information as to how to understand the social world around us. So the discipline of sociology assists us in the understanding of ourselves and our social world. Our worlds are created for us by others as well as being created by us for others. In today's world, keeping the study on just one society is much too limiting in today's world. With globalization, interdependence, and rapid change, sociology doesn't study just one society, it studies a global world of societies. Now, when we look at this on a more global perspective, I'm showing is a map of the world and looking at the world divided into higher income countries, middle income countries, and lower income countries. And when we look at this global sociological imagination, it is about looking outside of what we see our world to be and understand that other parts of the world, in some cases, are similar and other cases are quite different. And rather than judging them versus our own, using our sociological understanding of the world to see their world from their perspective as best we can. And that takes a lot of practice. Sociological imagination isn't something that comes by easy. So when we look at high-income countries, we consider the US, Canada, Japan, and these high-income or developed countries, they're highly industrialized economies, so they base their economies a lot on industry, technologically advanced industry. They have health and nutrition at a very high level. There's an administrative and service occupations, and relatively high levels of national and per person income. Whereas if you look at middle income, Mexico, Brazil as good examples. Now they are also rising um, as countries. These middle income countries, those with industrialized economies, particularly in the urban areas, not maybe so much in the rural areas, and moderate levels of national and personal income. Whereas lower income or underdeveloped countries like the sub-Saharan Africa, some parts of Asia, and in particular China and India, now they're faster growing in a very rapid way, but not in a very stable way as of yet. Low income, Developing countries, those are primarily agrarian, which is just basically saying they do a lot of agriculture as their primary source of income and economy. They don't have a lot of industrialization. Now, China and India both are really developing this, and they have low levels of national and personal income. Well, in those two countries in particular, they have very high populations, also with very large numbers of people living in the rural area where a lot of industrialization and personal incomes are low. Most of the early thinkers and philosophers thought about human behavior more in terms of how things ought to be rather than what is. So the advent of modern 19th century thinking saw a shift to observing people and their lives to better understand how they think and do so systematically in an order to verify. So rather than just judging based on, well, this is what we do and this is how we do it, you should be doing the same thing, as they began looking at the world around them by virtue of trying to understand the world from their perspective. And that's the sociological imagination at a global perspective. Now, there's two terms we'll discuss briefly towards the end, and it was industrialization and urbanization, and were key to make this shift in thinking in terms of how society has become more interdependent. Now, this next map here, this one is from gapminder.org. They have a lot of great resources of worldview and statistics, very rich in data. And this is a bubble map looking at the major countries in the world. I think there's 207 dots on this, breaking it up into different groups. The size of the bubble indicates the population size, the color based on regions in the world. And you're looking at the bottom as being what kind of money do people have, and up the side you're looking at health. Now, this is only one example to show the differences in countries of what we would call, lower income up to higher income. They tend to have more money and they tend to have better health. And health is being measured by virtue of children dying before the age of 5. Out of every 1,000 live birth, how many births are not making it to age 5? And that's considered by one measure as being poor health of a country. Countries with good health have very few babies dying before 5. Societies where there's poor health often don't have the infrastructure to support mothers who give birth, and oftentimes children don't make it to age 5. Okay, the last item I'd like to touch base on are life chances. And there is a relationship between people's social standing, what class they're in, if you will, in a society, and the person's opportunities to provide for themselves, get themselves the material goods by society standards, positive living conditions, favorable life experiences. Life chances are reflected in such measures as housing. Do you have an own house? Do you rent a house? What size home? How many bedrooms? What kinds of things in your home? By the education, how much education do you have? Because it's argued that the number one life chance there is education. Having education reduces family size in some parts of the world because they start to learn the impact about not only their family size, but find other more realistic ways to provide a living, and therefore don't need as many children. And health is another life chance. The healthier we are, the more successful we can tend to be. Occupying a higher position in society improves your life chances and brings greater access to social rewards. Greater protection, security, greater access to education, employment in higher incomes, and access to healthcare services and medicines. These all come with higher positions. And by contrast, people in lower social classes are forced to devote a larger proportion of their resources to necessities of life. They have less security or access to the quality education. For example, those of us who have been in higher income families had access to educational resources well before some families who had lower income. You had a computer, you had books and papers and pencils, and be able to take all the supplies to schools you needed. While other kids, they didn't have those things. And that made an advantage for those of us who could compared to those who couldn't. Therefore, access to decent pay reduces access to decent pay is reduced, children experience less health and quality of education, fewer resources like computers, list of school supplies needed, money. So that becomes a very important factor. Now the last thing I want to touch on is those two terms I mentioned earlier, industrialization and urbanization. Now industrialization represents the changes of means of production, or how people make a living. When societies are transformed from dependence on agriculture and handmade products to emphasis on manufacturing and related industries. Now, urbanization, this term means that the movement from people living rurally to the urban environments. This began the movement of greater independence between countries. Goods and services were produced everywhere, and vice versa. Humanity issues such as famine, conflict, and world markets became more of an issue as people moved to the cities. It marked a significant force for change on how societies operated and how societies grew. Now, industrialization changed the economy in 5 ways. It produced new sources of energy. We moved from human power to animal power to steam engine. Steam engine was 1775. It centralized the work into factories. So steam engine brought about work from the home to the factories. Now, there was some strength to that and some weaknesses to that. Now, we're not going to go into it in this particular class. Manufacturing and mass production was the third change to the economy. Not just that you could grow, now you could make from raw materials all sorts of things like furniture and clothing. The fourth change to the economy was specialization. They moved from work being done, moving work, doing all the steps, that is, one person did all the steps from beginning to end, to the beginning of the assembly line and workers doing a single task over and over again. And then the fifth was wage labor. With more factories, there became more laborers, not producing for themselves, but selling their labor to factory owners. Now, over the history of humans, we've had tons of shifts using both these elements. Hunting and gathering began for all the beginning of humans in an organized manner was 13,000 years ago or so. The pastoral agrarian, which is the civilization's agriculture, not having to move around hunting and gathering, was about 12,000 years ago. And then using the animal-driven use of the plow was about 5,000 years ago. And so we've gone through many, many changes over time, all of which we've been mechanizing, industrializing, and moving more and more people towards communal and city living. And these have had a huge impact on what we now call the society and developing of the science of what we now call sociology. Okay, good luck. I hope this has been helpful. Remember to go through your textbook. I hope you've made some notes. Remember, these videos are up for the entire semester, so you can take notes and go back over the videos as many times as you like. All right, thank you very much, and good luck.